Nights before Christmas are supposed to be soft, full of lights, warm kitchens, last-minute shopping and the hum of ordinary lives. But some nights arrive and take everything with them. On November 13, 2022, late into a small college town's ordinary morning, 4 young lives were taken from a house that wanted nothing more than the quiet of sleep and friendship. Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The faces, the laughter, the small, ordinary plans gone. The town of Moscow, Idaho, and the families and friends of the victims were left with a single, brutal question: who would do this, and why? Over the next year and a half the case would wind across state lines, through forensic breakthroughs, into millions of feeds and chat rooms, and finally into a courtroom where a man who studied crime became the accused. Tonight, we trace that path. We'll look at the victims, the night that changed everything, the hunt, the arrest, and the legal reckoning that followed. We'll also ask the question that will not let go: why? They were students, roommates, friends. Each one of them had a story that stretched far beyond a headline. Kaylee Goncalves, bright, present, someone who lit up social feeds with friendly posts and family photos. She loved music and had plans and dreams that had nothing to do with the tragedy that took her. Madison, Maddie Mogan, known as a steady friend, a person with a laugh that showed in her eyes. She was connected deeply to her family and community. Xana, creative, engaged, the kind of person whose absence leaves a shape you can't quite fill. Ethan Chapin, athletic, thoughtful, loved by those who knew him from sports and school activities. These were not archetypes. They were people who called home, who had holiday plans, jobs, classes, and future steps. The loss pierced their families, their classmates, and the campus in a way that would change the rhythm of holidays and study sessions for many months to come. On the morning of November 13, 2022, at an off-campus house near the University of Idaho, the ordinary turned catastrophic. In the quiet early hours, an intruder entered the home where the 4 victims lived. By dawn, those 4 would be dead. The town awoke first to confusion, then to grief. Investigators later pieced together a timeline using phone pings, neighbor reports, and footage from nearby cameras. The timeline became the skeleton of an investigation: who was near the house, where were their phones, which surveillance cameras recorded motion, and what traces, however small, did an intruder leave behind. November 13, 2022, early morning, 4 students killed. The immediate hours after the discovery were chaotic and careful. First responders, detectives, forensic teams, they came and went, documenting, preserving, trying to hold the forensic story together before it could fade. The investigation that followed was huge, not just in manpower but in public attention. Moscow, Idaho, a college town used to seasonal crowds and campus events, became the center of a nationwide story. Local law enforcement worked alongside state and federal partners. Homes nearby were checked. Leads were chased, and sometimes false paths grew before being pruned away. The country watched as investigators combed for DNA, analyzed cell phone location data, and reviewed layers of surveillance video. Those investigative threads, later made public through filings and press briefings, would be central in identifying a suspect. But this was also a story played out in public in ways that made the family's grief heavier. Social media, forums and message boards lit up with theories that pulled at anything and everything, some useful, some distracting, many painful. The families asked for respect. Investigators asked for patience. The online world, impatient and loud, pushed both. The months that followed were a slow, grinding piecework of forensics, DNA comparisons, attempts to extract data from damaged devices, analyzing goods purchased and movements recorded. For a long time, there was nothing to announce, only painstaking progress behind closed doors. The break came weeks later, not in Idaho but across the country. On December 30, 2022, in the middle of the holiday season, authorities arrested 28-year-old Bryan Christopher Kohberger at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The arrest shocked a country that had been watching for answers for more than 6 weeks. Investigators said that multiple lines of evidence connected Kohberger to Moscow, DNA results from items tied to the scene, cell phone data placing him in the region at key times, and surveillance footage that, when pieced together, painted a pattern. The arrest was the product of those lines converging months of lab work and investigative follow-up. News of the arrest produced mixed reactions. For some, it was a relief, a chapter that might finally allow families to seek answers in court. For others, it was only the start of a longer process that would again force the community to relive the trauma in hearings, filings, and testimony. Who was the man arrested? Bryan Christopher Kohberger was, at the time of his arrest, a doctoral student studying criminology. He had pursued graduate studies at Washington State University in the region. To many, the contrast between his academic-focused criminal justice and forensic methods and the accusations leveled against him created a dissonant, almost cinematic narrative. It's tempting to draw neat lines between study and motive. Experts in criminology warned against that urge. Education in the field doesn't cause violence, it can, however, create narrative hooks that make a case feel stranger than it is. What mattered legally was evidence, not the irony of the degree. Kohberger's background was scrutinized, where he'd lived, what jobs he'd held, his academic record, his social circles. Defense attorneys and prosecutors would later use portions of this background in filings, each seeking to frame the man in the way that best supported their case. For the public, the most mysterious part of the case was the how. How do investigators go from a crime scene to a person charged years later? The answer lies in modern forensics, patient detective work, and sometimes a bit of technological luck. Investigators pointed to DNA and cell phone location data as key elements linking the suspect to the crime scene. According to prosecutors' filings and later statements in court, DNA found on items associated with the house and other traces were analyzed and compared. When those traces matched DNA connected to the suspect, investigators had a critical scientific connection. In recent years, investigative genealogy and advanced DNA techniques have closed many cold cases, but they also raise privacy questions and require meticulous validation. Alongside DNA, cell phone location data, not the content of calls, but the location pings and connections to towers and Wi-Fi networks filled in movement patterns. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses helped confirm presence and timing. Put together, these pieces formed a mosaic. No single tile necessarily solved the case, but together they revealed a shape investigators felt confident charging. None of this is infallible. Defense teams routinely challenge the interpretation of forensic matches, the integrity of samples, and the methods for analyzing digital traces. Those disputes are exactly the sort of legal arguments that play out in pretrial motions and, sometimes, in jury trials. But in this case, prosecutors said the forensic ties were strong enough to support the charges. After the arrest, the case entered the slow, procedural world of modern criminal justice. There were arraignments, extradition paperwork, discovery battles, and motions. At multiple points, each side filed motions over what evidence could be used and how the case should proceed. Early on, prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty, a choice that raised the stakes and made the legal timeline even more consequential. When a state seeks capital punishment, it can lengthen the pretrial process enormously, because death penalty cases send material across many more legal checks and balances. For the families, a death penalty declaration meant the possibility of a trial so long and public that it would keep their pain in the public eye for years. For the defendant, it meant the potential of the most consequential punishment the state can impose. For all involved, it meant an even greater need for precise, airtight evidence. Trial date set, August 2025 or similar, if you reference previously scheduled dates. As pretrial litigation continued, the defense and prosecution sparred over what the jury would hear. Grand jury materials, rules about pretrial publicity, and motions to move venue or apply gag orders became routine and a reminder that the courtroom is where disputes over facts, evidence and interpretation are meant to be resolved. In July 2025, the case took a consequential turn. Rather than proceeding to the long trial many had anticipated, the defendant entered guilty pleas to multiple counts, admitting responsibility in open court. Prosecutors said the decision came as part of an agreement intended to avoid the death penalty. The plea resulted in 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana and Ethan Chapin. In addition, the sentence included extra years tied to burglary charges. Sentencing was formalized in July 2025 when a judge imposed the life terms. For many families, the plea was a double-edged moment. On one hand, an admission of guilt provided a kind of closure that a trial might not have guaranteed. On the other hand, pleas often deprive victims' families of a public airing of facts and testimony that could have further illuminated motive and details. Some family members expressed anger that the plea hearing came with limited notice. Others said the certainty of life sentences and the avoidance of a lengthy appeals process tied to a death penalty verdict spared them years of traumatic courtroom exposure. At sentencing hearings, families gave emotional statements, grief, love, fury, and sometimes a plea for the world to remember the living as much as the dead. The judge's ruling ended the criminal prosecution in a formal sense, but for those who loved Kaylee, Madison, Xana and Ethan, the sense of loss continued. One of the hardest parts of this story is that motive, the why, remains largely unresolved in public. Even after guilty pleas and life sentences, a clear explanation for why the killings occurred has not fully emerged in a way that satisfies families and the public. Prosecutors described elements of premeditation in court and filings actions they say reflected planning. But motive is not always a neat legal element in court cases. Sometimes it is discussed in testimony, sometimes it's inferred, and sometimes it is quietly left unknown. For the families, that absence is another wound. Knowing who did it does not always explain why. Psychologists and criminologists often point out that motive can be complex, multiple, and sometimes indecipherable without the defendant's candid cooperation. In this case, the defendant declined to provide a public explanation at sentencing, and that silence left the community with more questions than answers. The result is an uneasy finality. The legal case is closed, but the emotional and human questions, why these 4? Why that house? Why a student of criminology? Continue to echo. Violence of this scale reshapes community rituals. The University of Idaho and the Moscow community responded with vigils, scholarships, memorials, and conversations about safety and support. Students and faculty held candlelight ceremonies. The public created funds and memorials to honor the victims and to support their families. Scholarships were established in the victims' names, and long after the headlines receded, the work of remembrance continued. Counseling services expanded for students grappling with grief and trauma. The campus, once a place of spontaneous laughter and crowded study groups, had to relearn how to be both a living community and a memorial. For many in Moscow, holidays that followed were quieter. For families, anniversaries were a new kind of calendar mark, not merely celebratory dates but days that demanded remembrance. Community healing is slow and not linear. Some days feel almost normal, others are raw. The way forward has been about honoring the dead while rebuilding lives in small, significant steps.